Well, I think it's fair to say that life is full of unmet expectations. I know I've had a lot of expectations in life that I thought were going to come true, and they did not. And about 14 years ago, my wife Rachel and I had the opportunity to go to a seminar down in Atlanta. And after the people who picked us up at the airport was driving us to the location of this event, we were driving through a brand new bypass that they had constructed around the city. And I had never been to Atlanta, and so I had no idea what to expect. But what I had saw was very impressive. It was a very modern, clean, gleaming skyline, very unlike what you would see up here in the north. And so when we got to the seminar, there was a grandfatherly, distinguished-looking man that approached me. He knew that I wasn't from the area, and he had been from Atlanta. And so we struck up a conversation. And he basically just made small talk, and finally he just said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from an area called Lake Geneva, and it's between Milwaukee and Chicago." And I said, "I just want to tell you, I am very impressed with the city that you have here. I've never been here before. It's beautiful. It's new and modern and clean, and the roads are terrific, unlike Chicago's." And he said to me, he said, "Well, it ought to be you guys burned it down." Now, obviously a reference to the Civil War. So I in turn said, "Well, at least our side won." And no, I didn't. I really didn't. I wanted to, but I didn't. Needless to say, the expectation that I had when I first met this guy was completely unmet. Not what I was expecting in life. Not what I was expecting at that time either. Well, many of you know from past messages that I love to do character studies on characters of the Old Testament. And today we're going to talk about Esther. Esther is an interesting individual. She had a lot of unmet expectations in life. And I'm going to have to do a little bit of a background on this, so you're going to have to bear with me so we can save time. Esther is an orphan, in exile, and she's Jewish. And she's living during a time of a king named Xerxes. Now, at this time, this particular king is having a very lavish celebration. And some of these celebrations could last for days. And it says in the scriptures that during the course of this celebration, he happens to be in high spirits. So I'm going to probably estimate that he's probably a little intoxicated, he's in a good mood, and he has a wife named Queen Vashti, and she happens to be very beautiful. He asks her to come to his presence, and he wants to show off his beauty to all the people that are in attendance, and she refuses. Well, needless to say, this is kind of before the Now movement and the feminist movement, and pretty much if the king said jump, you jump. And if you didn't, chances are you're probably going to be killed. Well, she refuses, and he doesn't kill her, but he basically banishes her from his presence, which leaves an opening for a new wife for King Xerxes. And they kind of create what I would say an ancient version of like the Bachelor show that we know today, and they kind of gather a group of women who are candidates to be a new wife for the king. Now, Esther happens to be being raised by her cousin Mordecai, and Mordecai enters Esther into this competition. But one of the things he tells her is that under no circumstances are you to tell anyone that you are Jewish, and there's a reason for this. Well, we're going to read in Esther 2, and I just want you to get an idea of just how in-depth this whole system and process was. It was a really big deal. All right. It says, when the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. The girl pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatment, special food. He assigned to her 7 maids selected from the king's palace and moved her to her maids into the best place of the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a girl came to go to King Xerxes, she had made a complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for her, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anytime she wanted, she was given to her from the king's harem. And in the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem into the care of the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. So he would return to the king unless he was pleased, and with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to the king Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any other woman, and she won his favor and approval more than any other of the virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head, made her queen, instead of Vashti, and the king gave her a great banquet, Esther's banquet for all the nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts and royal liberality. Well, all of us have had the fine privilege of watching a Lifetime movie on the cable network. And everyone knows that the Lifetime movies are always the same. There is a beautiful woman who has this wonderful life, and there is either a man or a series of men that enter said life, somehow mess it up, and then the woman has to figure out how to put all the pieces of the puzzle back together, and then her life is wonderful again, and then the commercial break comes, right? That's a Lifetime movie in a nutshell. All right. Well, Esther's life is kind of like a Lifetime movie, but with a twist, all right? Because what winds up happening is there is actually a series of men that enter her life that kind of make things a little complicated. The first one is Mordecai, her cousin. As he goes back and forth through the King's Gate, which is kind of a social area for that culture, he happens to come across 2 guards that are plotting to assassinate the king. So what he does is he takes that information, he goes to Esther and says, this is what's going to happen, and she somehow forwards that information to the king, and the plot is averted. But then there's man number 2, and there's a noble named Haman. Now this particular guy is very, very egotistical and selfish and unbelievably prideful. And as Mordecai goes through the King's Gate, like everyone else, he is expected to have people honor him. So I'm going to assume probably some type of a bow or a curtsy that he's expecting because of his high position. What winds up happening is Mordecai refuses to do it, and this just incenses Haman. So he does a little background check on Mordecai, and he finds out that he's a Jewish exile living in the land and he wants him killed. But he doesn't stop there. He finds out that he's Jewish, and he wants all the Jews killed. So he goes to the king and he says, I'm going to set aside money in the treasury, and we're going to take and just wipe out all of these people in one day. We're going to hire basically mercenaries from outside the country or even within, and one day we're just going to do a clean sweep and it's going to be over with. And the king's like, whatever, I don't care. Do with it whatever you want. And the edict goes out to the land, and the people find out. Well, naturally this is very disturbing to Mordecai, and he goes to Queen Esther and basically says, do you have any idea what's going on? Now remember, no one knows in the king's palace that Esther is Jewish. And this is where the complication comes, and this is where the surrender of the heart starts to take form. We're going to go to Esther 4, and we're going to see what kind of communication Mordecai and Esther had. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, Relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Mordecai is basically saying, hey, look, one way or another, something's going to go down. And God's will is going to be done, but it may not be done the way that it could have been done if perhaps maybe you're willing to surrender the life that you have. Now, I'm not going to get into the head of Esther. There's no way I can, but I'll be honest, if I was in that situation, I think I would look at it and say, hey, I was an orphan, I've had a hard life, it all makes sense now. Now my life is wonderful, and I can see how God worked through all of this, and I'm just going to leave it alone. That's how I would think. And I'm sure there was a little bit of that in Esther as well. But Mordecai is basically saying, think about this. It's not just about you. There's other people on the line. There's my life, there's your family's life, there's people who are of Jewish descent, their lives are on the line. And don't just think because you're the queen, they're going to find out that you're Jewish, and what's to stop them from killing you as well? About 4 years ago, my wife and I went on a journey to become foster parents. And we had wanted to have more kids after our son, but we couldn't. And so my wife had a friend who was in the foster care system here in Walworth County, and our intentions were to adopt a child. And it was soon after we went through the preliminary meetings that 2 little girls, they were twins, became available, and they came into the protection of our house. About 6 months into that journey, there is a meeting. It's a very normal meeting. It's like a review process where you meet with the caseworker and that person's supervisor, the biological family, and then there's kind of like some randomly picked monitors that will sit in the meeting just to listen. And as the meeting went on, about 5 minutes into this meeting, a man just abruptly enters the room, and I had no idea who he was, and nor did any of the people who worked for the county had any idea, but it wound up being a lawyer that the biological family had hired. And what was supposed to be a 45-minute kind of just general meeting wound up being a well over 2-hour meeting that basically complicated things quite a bit. We were kind of into this thinking, hey, we're just trying to take care of these girls, we want to adopt them, and after that meeting, everything changed. I can remember leaving the county building that morning. Both my wife had to go back to work. And it was a beautiful, sunny, December, crisp winter morning, a lot like today. And normally I would be on cloud 9 because I love it when it's sunny in the winter. And I was driving back to Whitewater, and I was experiencing what I like to call a dark abyss moment. And I don't know if you guys have had these, but I've had several of them, and they're not fun because you kind of realize that you're over your head, and whatever strengths you think you have are not going to be up to the task of what you're going to be dealing with. So I'm sitting there in my car, and usually I would be praying, talking to God like I'm just talking to you now. And I was silent for quite a while, and then I had a little bit of a tantrum with God, and I was expecting him to answer me, and he didn't. My expectation was he was going to just, pat me on the shoulder and just be like, hey, it's all good, don't worry about it. I'm on your side, everything's cool. But that answer never came. And as a matter of fact, it took a long time for an answer to come. Well within our journey of being foster parents. When that answer came, it was not what I wanted to hear. In essence, he basically said, Chris, I know exactly how you feel about those people in that room. I know you're mad. I know you don't like them. And I know you love the girls. But the fact of the matter is those people in that boardroom, when you got so upset, I love those people as much as I love you. And as a matter of fact, the only reason you and your family have this opportunity is because I gave it to you. Now, I have to kind of preface this by saying that as Rachel and I were going through this journey, both of us were dealing with the same things at the same time. But she was so far ahead of me, spiritually, maturity-wise, everything, in dealing with these people. God was talking to her in very powerful ways, and I was going through a spiritual famine at that time. It was horrible. And I was really learning a lot from her. It's interesting about life, and this is one of the lessons that I learned during that time. And it's hard to say this, but sometimes in life, you have to really find out how vulnerable you really are until you can get stronger. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm going to say that again because I got to hear it. Sometimes you have to realize how vulnerable you are in life until you can get stronger. And that was a very vulnerable time in my life. Well, Esther's in this situation because there's a 50-50 chance that she's either going to die or live. If she goes to the king, she could die. If she doesn't go to the king, she's probably going to die. It's up to God now, and she's got to surrender this whole situation to him. Well, we're going to go to Esther 7, and I'm going to just set up this scene. Because what winds up happening is she does something kind of clever. She basically sets up a dinner banquet for the king, for herself, and Haman. And it's kind of a nonchalant, way of being able to get the king's attention, but also not being in a situation where it's kind of like demanding, I need your time, you need to listen to me. Because this isn't like a town hall meeting during the election year. You can't just go to some public place and start spouting all your concerns to elected officials. I mean, this is not a democracy. What's interesting about this situation is Mordecai, when he wound up saving the king's life, he was never rewarded for his efforts. And it says in the Bible that the king couldn't sleep previous to this dinner engagement. And what winds up happening is he sends in one of his attendants, and he asks him to start reading about some of the things that happened in his reign. Now, I have no idea why. Maybe he was bored. Maybe this is just their way of, finding some way to kill time. It could have been just a way for him to maybe boost his ego. This is what I've done. I have no idea. At any rate, the attendant starts reading the chronicles of his reign, and Mordecai's name happens to come up. And it says, this particular gentleman saved your life and informed people in the government that the king was going to or that you were going to be assassinated. And he asks his attendant, he says, well, was anything ever done for Mordecai? And he says, no, nothing was ever done. So, in ironic fashion, he goes to Haman, the king, and he says, I would like you to reward Mordecai for what he did. And he got a wonderful honor, and Mordecai just was incensed. He didn't know what to do with himself, because this is the very man that Haman wants to kill. Well, we go to chapter 7 in Esther, and it's very interesting because in Lifetime movie channel fashion, it ends in a spectacular way, but there's a twist to the story. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and as they were drinking wine, on the second day, the king again asked Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life, this is my petition, and spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. And if we were merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" And Queen Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman realized that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind, and begged Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while he is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows, and he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Chances are, if Esther had not done what she had done, I'm almost certain that she would have died, and Mordecai would have died, and there probably would have been a remnant left of the Jews who had escaped that area. If she had taken control, what she perceived, what was necessarily hers, which really wasn't, it was just given to her, I think things would have turned out quite differently. She realized that surrendering to God was her only option, even though it was not an easy thing and she had everything to lose. Well, what's interesting about surrender in the spiritual life is that you naturally think, "Oh, I'll just give it all to God. I don't have to do anything, and it's just all taken care of." But see, the reality is so surrendering to God doesn't necessarily mean there's no action on our part. It just means that we've got to relinquish what we perceive as control in our own life. Well, what winds up happening is the edict to eliminate the Jews is not gone. It still stands. But what the king allows the Jews to do is he allows them to assemble, and he allows them to bear arms and protect themselves. Now, they could have hid, they could have done whatever, maybe tried to escape. But what winds up happening is Esther and Mordecai are able to rally the Jews to fight against the mercenaries that are going to come that one day to clean them out. Now, it talks about in the Bible, when I did a little bit of study on this, that they're kind of surmising that Haman's plan to pay for this was to use the plunder of whatever the Jews had. Now, I have no idea how wealthy the Jews were at this time. But one of the things that they were surmising in the notes that I read was that they were going to basically say to these people, kill as many as you can, and whatever you're able to claim as your own, it's just more motivation to kill more people. That's how bloodthirsty this whole situation was. Well, they assemble, they bear arms, and they're able to basically wipe out the mercenaries that come to that region to kill the Jews. It's an overwhelming victory for the Jews. Mordecai winds up being honored and is proclaimed within the king's government. Queen Esther keeps her position. But it wasn't without action. And if she hadn't surrendered, again, the outcome would have been completely different. Well, 4 years passed, and we were finally able to adopt those girls. But I will tell you that both my wife and I have stated that we were never the same people when we started that journey and when we came out of it. On many levels, we were very much more calloused, but spiritually, I think we learned so much about ourselves that I never in my life thought that I could be pushed that hard. Honestly, I think if we had known what we were getting into, I think sometimes we would think, wow, what would we have done? But I know that it was the right thing. We've got two beautiful girls in our house that are our own now, and I could see how God worked. But I will tell you, there were days it was so painful, I don't think I could even really even talk about it. But we surrendered, and it worked out. And I can remember walking out of that courthouse on a beautiful June day, the judge signing the papers, and walking out of that building, not realizing and couldn't believe that it was finally over after 4 years. I guess what I'd like to challenge you with today is this. There are a lot of things in life that impact us. I mean, there's people, there's finances, there's work, there's our past, there's the present, and what we perceive is going to be the future, even though we have no idea what that's going to be. And I will tell you that I have not surrendered everything in my life, but I'm trying. I'm getting there. But it's one step at a time. And I don't think God is asking us to just, it's all going to be, on a flip of a switch, everything is going to be perfect, because it doesn't work like that. We all know it doesn't. But I guess I'm going to challenge you with this. There are things in your life that I know that you're not surrendering, just as I am, God. And you're fighting. And I think God is gently nudging you and saying, look, you got to give it up. You're going to be in a better place if you do. It's not going to be easy, but it's simple. And there is a difference. There are people that I have met that have gone through horrendous situations. They've gone through death, they've been physically abused, they've been in jail. Terrible things that if the world were to look at them, they would say, why aren't you in this dark abyss? Why aren't you feeling it? But because they've surrendered their life to God, because they've surrendered those situations to God, spiritually, they're feeling that wonderful winter, cloudless, sunny morning that I saw in December, but I couldn't enjoy it because spiritually, I just wasn't there. Does that make sense? There's things that spiritually we cannot relate to as natural beings unless God gets involved with it. And I know it sounds crazy, and it doesn't really make sense to me a whole lot. Because we live in a physical world, we're impacted by physical things, but God is spiritual, and so are we. But we don't really tap into that a whole lot. So I guess I'm going to ask you this. Think about this week, the things in your life. It may be one thing, it may be many things, I don't know, that God is asking you to surrender. It's weird because one of the things that I've learned about some of the things that I've had to give to God is that you're in a really bad place, right? Sometimes in life. Sometimes when you surrender that thing to God, for a little while, you're actually in a worse place than the thing that you're actually experiencing. But if you can come out in the end, you're going to be stronger and better for it. Does that make sense? I mean, it's almost as if the very pain that you're going through, sometimes you actually have to feel it even more to get past that. And that's part of the whole process of surrender. So I ask you again, think about the things that you're fighting for in your life. You really don't have control of it, even though you think you do. And I guess the blessing that's going to come out of it is that even though, from the world standpoint, They may look at you and say, man, why aren't you in this dark abyss? You can say, because I've surrendered it to God. Spiritually, that morning that I'm feeling, the sun is lighting it up, and I can't explain it, but God can. And that's part of surrendering your heart to God. I hope that if you do, you're going to be able to experience that sky lighting up.